ladies and gentlemen. Today we have in our podcast Harriet Brown and Grahame Jackson. I will have a little small introduction about both of them, and then they can amend what have I missed. Grahame is a partner at Hassans International Law Firm. His specialties are taxation, companies, international taxation topics, and EU direct taxation. Grahame, could you please tell about the firm?
So we are the largest law firm in Gibraltar. We were established in 1939 and we have about 300 people. We're a full service firm. We offer everything from buying and selling houses to building international tax sensitive structures, trusts, companies. We have an attached fiduciary business called Line Group, which is, I think, either the biggest or the second biggest in Gibraltar. So we are, we cover all the bases, and I started working here in 2002 as a fiduciary, as a company secretary, and retrained as a lawyer in my 30s. So it's a big firm. We've got a good reputation.
Oh, how big is your tax practice there?
So the thing is, for a lot of the commercial lawyers, we embed tax throughout the practice. So you will, if you come to a commercial lawyer, you will meet somebody who has some tax knowledge. The actual highly specialist tax piece is probably maybe 3 or 4 of us, but it's an integral part of everything, of all the cross-border work that we do, certainly.
Right. And you said that you didn't qualify as a lawyer until the age of 38. What's your life story then?
So I left. So my father set up a small printing business in the late 1960s. And then I came along and went to university, and I left university in 1993. And then when I left university, my dad basically gave me the keys to the factory and said, "You're in charge. I'm retiring." And it sounds very grand. There was 5 of us, and we turned over less than £250,000 in the early 90s. So we weren't very big, but we dealt with some very big international companies. So Maersk and a company called Sea Containers, the Orient Express. They were our 3 biggest customers in London, and we were providing goods down to London from the northwest of England. So we were selling on service, and that was very important to us and important to the client. And then through various steps, we sold the company, and I moved to Gibraltar when my earn-out period was up. And then the only job I could get in Gibraltar was as a company secretary, a very junior company secretary. And so that would have been in 2002. I'd have been 31. And then by the time I was 33, I'd started to retrain. The firm had said, "Oh no, okay, we'd like him to be a lawyer, so we'll retrain him." And then I did the classic route of converting my degree to a law degree, and then taking the LPC, doing it all part-time with a full-time job. And then eventually I qualified in 2008, 2009, something like that.
Right.
So yes, I'm not like Harriet, who's taken the traditional route.
Almost the traditional route.
I think it gives especially more as a solicitor. So obviously we've got a split profession. Harriet's a barrister and I'm a solicitor. I think from the solicitor's perspective, because we're more client-facing, I think it gives a depth of understanding of people that I'm dealing with. An emotional connection with the people I'm dealing with, rather than having just gone through the route and been an employee of a law firm all my life. I know what it's like to not be able to pay the wages on a Thursday because the check hasn't cleared or the bank transfer hasn't arrived.
And Gibraltar, would you tell us more about moving to Gibraltar? What was the reasoning behind, and to be honest, the first time I came across Gibraltar was quite recently when Latvia was playing football against Gibraltar. What is the country like, and how do you like living there?
So it's very small. It's 2.5 miles long and 1.5 miles wide. It has a population of 28,000. It's essentially a big village. We all know each other. And if we don't know each other, then we know somebody who knows the other person. You can, like, all life is here in a very small space. So we have supermarkets, we have big four accountants, we have law firms, we have guys that can mend your car. We have, like, it's an entire economy in one very small concentrated space. It's a fascinating place. It has its own identity and even a language called Janito, which is like a fusion of all the different influences that have been here. So it's got Portuguese words in it and Sephardi words in it and Spanish words in it and English words in it. The base grammar is Spanish, but it does have a strong identity. And if you'd been here on September the 10th, you'd have seen it, because that's our national day, when the whole town dresses in red and white and everybody goes down to the square and there's a big party and lots of balloons. It's comfortable expressing its identity in a way that I don't think that the UK is, which is quite different from somebody coming from England. I mean, Harriet will know, you don't fly the Union Jack outside your front window in England. It feels a bit odd. I walk down the street here and the Union Jack's hanging out of people's windows everywhere. They feel very confident in their identity. It's a good place, you know. I enjoy it, and we have a very good standard of living. There are 5 beaches within walking distance of where I'm sitting right now.
Wow. And the weather is good.
Yes, not today. We've got a bit of what we call mizzle, which is somewhere between mist, drizzle, and rain at the minute, but it's still about 25 degrees today.
And the last question, and then we turn to Harriet. But 300 lawyers, it's quite. To me, it sounds like a large amount.
So we're not 300 lawyers. We're 300 people. So we have
anyway.
82 lawyers, and then we have 70-something people working in the fiduciary business. But yes, it's a big firm. It's a big practice.
Right, a big practice. What would be a typical work you would do for a client?
So we have a lot of. We offer almost like a family office type service to international families. We are all necessarily facing towards the UK because of our constitutional connections, and we also face towards Israel because of the firm's background. We build a lot of structures for people who are in the correct position. So a res non-dom in the UK, and similar statuses around the world, that they could use our services. But then we also do, you know, there's a thriving property market in Gibraltar. We have a status in Gibraltar called HEPS and CAT 2, which are something akin to the Portuguese non-habitual resident. We offer those services and we build people's lives for them. We set up structures. We're very heavily involved in the gaming industry, which Gibraltar is the center of globally. It really is a full service firm. Me personally, I do a lot of work with cross-border family structures.
Right. Harriet, now to you. You're a barrister and Jersey advocate at Old Square Tax Chambers, which I read is a leading set of barristers' chambers specializing in taxation and revenue law. Could you please tell us about the Old Square Tax Chambers? Is it a law firm or some looser association?
Okay, so barristers are a bit of, the way we work is a bit anachronistic and also a bit unusual in that we are not a partnership or a firm in any sense. We are a chambers, which is sort of, it's almost like a cost sharing arrangement, but it's a bit more than that. So we sort of, in my chambers, there's about 14 of us. We're very small compared to Grahame's outfit. And we all share a building, 15 Old Square in Lincoln's Inn in London. And we have clerks who clerk for us. And so we do share the cost of that, but it's much more than that as well, without being a partnership. So we will sort of market ourselves together. We will do training together. We bring on a training barrister, is referred to as a pupil. I did say that the world was a bit anachronistic, so a training barrister is called a pupil. We will have pupils in chambers and bring those on and bring them hopefully into chambers. So it is an unusual way of working, but practically, I don't think it's necessarily very different to being in a firm or anything like that. We don't all sit in our separate rooms and ignore each other. We do have a good collegiate atmosphere.
Right, right. And I read that you advise on in relation to direct and indirect taxes, frequently in context of individuals and trusts, that you appear in courts against HMRC quite a lot. You're an author of books, The New Jersey Law of Trusts, and co-author of the International Interaction of EU Treaty Freedoms and the UK Tax Code.
It's a snappy title, that one.
Sorry about my English. Do you practice mostly in England and Wales or Jersey?
So my practice is primarily English law, so primarily in England and Wales. I'd say it varies from year to year, but it's probably about 85% English law, 15% Jersey law. I do, however, have a lot of clients in Jersey and also in Guernsey and the Isle of Man, because what I quite often find is people, where they have a Jersey law issue, so they've got a trust governed by Jersey law and they have a tax issue with it, they find it helpful to have me because I have that background in the Jersey law, and so I don't suggest things that aren't compatible with Jersey law. So it's just sort of, it does come into my English practice, and my English tax practice inevitably comes into my Jersey practice. But yes, I'm primarily based in the English law. Right.
And Jersey, how did you start practicing there?
So it was my career, how I ended up practicing tax as a barrister, was sort of a series of almost non-decisions. I didn't do law at university, and I did archaeology and anthropology, and there aren't that many archaeologists, and I think possibly even fewer anthropologists. So I finished my degree and I thought, oh, what am I going to do now? And so I decided originally and excitingly to do a law conversion. I decided I wanted to be a barrister rather than a solicitor, and I honestly can't remember why now. So I went and did the vocational stage of training, which then was called the BVC, and I think is now called the BTPC, but anyway. And I couldn't get a training job. So a training job is a pupillage. I couldn't get a pupillage straight away. I had a year's gap. And I thought, I need to do something. Sadly, I don't have the funds to just go travelling or anything like that. So I started thinking about what I wanted to do for a year. And I didn't particularly just want to go and sit in a big firm somewhere in the UK. And I'd done a mini pupillage, which is just sort of like work experience, with a barrister who had a lot of clients in Jersey. And so I looked into Jersey, and that was why I ended up there. And I worked at a firm then called Morant de Funjean, now called Morant Ozams, for about 2 years. For about 3 years, and then so I extended my time in Jersey so that I could qualify there, and then came back and did pupillage. But I met my husband there, and he still lives there most of the time, and so I have a strong connection to Jersey. And though it's been an unusual sort of route to where I am, not as unusual as Grahame's, but slightly unusual, I can't regret it at all. I'm very fond of Jersey, and I'm very fond of my Jersey practice and Jersey colleagues.
Right. And like I said, you wrote a book on Jersey law of trusts. What would be a typical occasion when Jersey trusts are established?
So this has changed over time. They used to be used very heavily, and I think they still will be used for non-UK domiciliaries or non-UK residents who might have UK property. They used to be used in a lot of structuring, which would hopefully bring property outside of the UK tax net. So a common one, which one wouldn't do anymore, you would have, say, a big house in London worth a lot of money, and you would use a company to buy that, and the company shares, a non-UK company, and the company shares would be owned by the Jersey Trust. Now, that used to be effective to take that property outside of the UK inheritance tax net. It isn't anymore since I think about 2018, 2017, but that we used to see a lot of that. And so, of course, we still see a lot of those structures because they're still there. And the other thing that we see them a lot for, you see quite a lot of pensions, maybe more in Guernsey, but you see pension funds and things using them, people who are internationally mobile. And of course, nowadays, even though you don't have those traditional tax reasons for using them, it's a very well established it's got a very well established trusts industry. And so I think you can feel quite a lot of confidence in your trustees if you have a Jersey trust, or at least Jersey resident trustees. So I think that's a big part of why people set up Jersey trusts as well.
I'm currently reading a book called Moneyland, and it partially reflects also some real estate that you mentioned that is located in London. Where it's difficult for the authorities to sort of track who's behind that property. Considering the topic of your book, the information exchange and your profession, what would be your comments regarding those properties? Is it now changing that the authorities will know for who's behind?
I think it really is. I'm familiar with Moneyland, and in some ways I think it's a little bit unfair, because a lot of offshore jurisdictions like Jersey and Gibraltar and Guernsey have for a very long time, comparatively, had more stringent rules for identification and things like that than mainland jurisdictions have had. And indeed, they have been very proactive in adopting information exchange regimes like CRS and now DAC6 or MDR. So certainly, I think, and also we have trust registration now as well, don't we? Most jurisdictions now have a trust registration. And so I think it really is changing. People are and we have registers of beneficial ownership of companies as well. So I think we really are changing the landscape, and it is going to become, well, it is much harder than it was even 5 years ago, but certainly 10 years ago, to obscure ownership in the way that Moneyland discusses.
Right.
I mean, so just to butt in there, MDR itself, the mandatory disclosure regime, is designed to stop you doing that.
Exactly.
Or as is Hallmark D of DAC6. So I think the world is changing. It is just none of the tools that we had in Gibraltar or that you had in Jersey were unique to Gibraltar or Jersey. They came from the English common law. The trust comes from the English common law. So there was nothing that you could do here that you couldn't do in the UK. I think it's.
I think, to be fair, in Jersey you could have purpose trusts that weren't charitable, which you can't do in the UK, and those are a big issue for obscuring ownership. But of course, since CRS, what you have seen is people abandoning purpose trusts. I don't think they were particularly common anyway, but people abandoning them because they're impossible to deal with for information exchange regimes, and you can't set up bank accounts and things. So it is working.
Yeah.
Right. Guys, did I miss anything important about your life journey so far?
I don't, not for me. I don't think so. I think that's as much as anyone would want to know.
Right. A joint podcast, joint book, Grahame in Gibraltar and Harriet in the UK. How did you start to cooperate?
So Harriet came on what would you say? What would you call it? Like a marketing trip about 10
marketing
years
trip.
ago. Yeah. About 10 years ago. And just as so slightly before or just as I qualified, I can't remember. Just after I qualified, I think you've been qualified a couple of years. When my then boss said, "Oh, you need to go and meet this woman," and we had a very awkward cup of coffee where we didn't really know what to say to each other. And then we didn't speak to each other for
8-9 years.
8-9 years. It wasn't deliberate. I mean, it was just our paths didn't cross. And then we encountered each other through
a mutual client.
Mutual client, didn't we? Yeah.
Yeah.
I was like, I'm sure I know that name. And then I looked at my bookshelf, and you know those. I mean, Yanis, you must have those books that you inherit from people when they leave because they've retired. They're never going to want to look at this book again. And there was Harriet's Jersey Law of Trust book on my bookshelf. I thought, okay, right. I'm meant to talk to this woman. And then we just got talking, didn't we? I was sort of writing. I was starting to write articles and thinking about. I was doing a lot of. It was during lockdown.
It was, yeah.
During lockdown, so I was doing a lot of like online training sessions for DAC 6, and I was sort of like trying to get myself out there doing that. And then we suggested write an article, and then Harriet said, "Well, why don't we write a book?" And then somebody said, "Well, why don't we do a podcast? It's easy to do. We can get something out there." And then it just sort of happened, didn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, and we were going to write a book on DAC 6, and indeed we had pretty much written a book on DAC 6, and then both the UK and Gibraltar, New Year's Eve last year, announced that they were out. Well, the UK announced that it was out of DAC 6 and it was just doing MDR, and so it became much less relevant what we'd written to our target, sort of to the people who we work with and for. And so we decided to expand the whole scope to information exchange generally, which I think was a really good idea, which we probably would have been too lazy to do had it not been for the change in legislation.
I must admit, I cried on New Year's Eve when all the work that I'd done, all the good HMRC guidance references that I had in my sections about DAC 6 were thrown in the bin. I was so upset.
Right. We're slowly switching to the next topic, which is your new book. So congratulations. It's published just in September this year. It's called Practitioner's Guide to International Tax Information Exchange Regimes. So congratulations, guys. It's published by spiramos.com. Publishing house. Anyone who wants to buy the book can go to their webpage, spiramos.com. And I also searched through the webpage and bumped into an interesting book, A Practical Guide to VAT for Golf Clubs. I'm golf player myself, and I was curious about the book and more curious who was the author, by Ian Fleming. So
Ian Fleming, there's much hilarity around the fact that the man who wrote that has got the same name as the guy who invented James Bond. Apparently, we were talking to our publisher the other day. We had a party for the book launch, and we were talking to our publisher, and he said that at one point it was listed in the spy novels on Amazon.
Cool, really cool. So how was the presentation of your book?
It was good. Yes.
It wasn't online, right?
No, it wasn't. We just had a good few people in London as an initial sort of launch. My head of chambers came. Somebody came from the Gibraltar government. Yeah. So it was well received, and it was the first thing I've done in person since I think lockdown started. The first lockdown started in the UK back in March 2020. So it was actually really nice to get out and about. And I think we are having a launch of sorts next month online for people who obviously couldn't make it to London. So I think we're going to do a little. Well, right. I've sent you an email, Grahame. we're going to talk about some of the topics in the book. So yes.
Oh, and we're appearing, aren't we, next week?
Yes.
live on stage in Gibraltar, which is we've been invited to the KPMG do what they call an e-summit. It's like an event of several different talks and networking event for the gaming industry. So we're going to be appearing there. So live and in person. Wow, we should get some T-shirts with "on tour" written on them.
Yeah, it's really exciting. It's the first time I'm going to be on an aeroplane since March 2020, and because my practice is quite international, I used to travel a fair bit, so it's been strange just staying put for so long. So it is all very exciting.
Right, right.
It's
Seriously,
sorry, go on.
Go on.
It's quite well received, and I think it's an important. Nobody. The reason that we started this was because there was no text out there. Though Oliver Hoare from Luxembourg, if that's how you pronounce his name, HOOR, has written it's called MDR, Mandatory Disclosure Regime in Luxembourg, but it deals mostly with DAC 6. So there's basically two texts in the English language, and ours is a much wider analysis because we look at all of the regimes apart from CBC, don't we? At
the moment, yes, and we have hopes for CBC in the future.
Yeah, the second edition will be expanded.
Right. It's a huge work you have done so far. The book itself is over 400 pages. How long was the drafting process and what it was like?
So Grahame and I work in quite different ways, which I think has been quite frustrating for Grahame. Grahame is very measured, and he's the sort of writer I would like to be. He sits down, he does a little bit, and he gets it done. I sit down when I'm really starting to panic because I'm approaching a deadline and write an awful lot. So I think overall, including the time to get that first lot of DAC 6, it's probably been about a year, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think I sat down and started typing sometime around October last year. Yeah. But to be fair to Harriet, I think my chapters were more easily doable in bite-sized bits because I did DAC 6, so it's the hallmarks as each individual hallmark. You can't write, whereas Harriet just sat down and did FATCA in one go.
Wrote not quite one go, but yes.
30,000 words on FATCA. But I think the total word count's about 160,000 words, isn't it?
I think that's right. Yes. Yeah. Oh. And I think so. It was, given that it is such a big topic, I don't think that a year is an awfully long time to do it. But I know James Kessler QC, my head of chambers, is a prolific author. He loves to write, and he writes a lot. He writes a big book that some people might be familiar with called Taxation of Non-UK Residents and Foreign Domiciliaries. And when I say a big book, it's about 6 volumes. And he always says, it doesn't need to be perfect, just get it done, and then you can improve it or even correct it in your next edition. And I think we've had to try and stick to that. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had a book. We'd have had a book in about a decade, which would have been about 8 volumes long. But yeah, wouldn't have been much use to us or anybody else for the intervening decade.
And that comes, I think, from the newness of the topic.
Yes, I think
there are so many things that people just don't know the answer to because the guidance isn't clear, or because there isn't any guidance, or my favourite, the OECD know it's a difficult question, so they won't take a position on it. We've, and I think in our introduction we say this, that part of the process of understanding a new area of law is that people take positions, and then there's arguments about whether that position is correct or not, and then almost in a Hegelian way, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So that's what somebody has to do. They have to take a position so that there can be another position taken, and then we can find the valid answer through the process of discourse.
Quite. Right. I once did a case with a very experienced commercial QC, and he had a lovely expression. He'd say, when this happens, I say my thinking has matured. And that's what he used to say when he got something wrong. He'd say, my thinking has matured on this, and I now agree with you. And so, yes, this is the process by which our thinking will mature, should it need to, I think.
Yeah.
Right. Just reflecting what Harriet just said about your writing routines, I I must confess that I have another hobby. I'm gathering materials now for a tax/legal thriller, and I I'm wondering about your routines, Grahame. Do you write in like mornings or evenings? How do you organize yourselves?
So I have my wife works with a dog charity. And she goes to the dog shelter on a Saturday morning and comes back in mid-afternoon. So I write on a Saturday morning and mid-afternoon, and then I'll write after work if the time requires it. But I don't get up early. Getting up early is Harriet's thing. I'm not interested in getting up. No, it's my wife is very long suffering and makes space for me to do this. And without the support of the people around us, I don't think we could have done it, could we?
No, that's absolutely right. You need people to help you carve out the time to get it done.
Yeah.
Yeah. And how did you divide the competences among yourselves?
I said, I don't want to do MDR. You can do that. It was just easily apparent, wasn't it, who was the right one?
Yes, so I think I've given quite a lot of advice over the last few years on FATCA and CRS, so I had a lot of material and knowledge to start from there. Grahame knew a lot more about DAC6 than me. I don't quite know why you got landed with DOTAS, but
because you didn't want to do it.
Yes,
you were taking too long, so I just did it.
And now you know why.
And the history and context chapter, we have a history and context chapter at the front, so it's not just a dry textbook. It does explain why we are here. That's just I'm actually interested in why in the fact the League of Nations produced a model exchange agreement as a sister to the model double taxation agreement in 1927, and yet nobody ever implemented it. I mean, that really interests me. Why did that happen? All of the things that people talk about now with low tax jurisdictions, none of that would exist if that had been different.
Right. And if we scroll through the contents of the book, there's history and context, like you said. There's types of exchange, interpretation, disclosure of tax avoidance schemes, all sorts of abbreviations like FATCA, CRS, DAC6, and mandatory disclosure regime, exchange of information under tax treaties, really extensive stuff. Will the tax authorities all over the world be able to process this huge amount of data? Will they become huge data processing entities, or this will be just formally done, but maybe not executed well?
That is a really interesting question, and particularly from the perspective of onshore jurisdictions who are most likely to, I think, benefit, as it were, from having the information. I know with FATCA, I got the impression that when the IRS, I mean, this is just my impression, but I got the impression from what came out after that when the IRS first got the information, there was certain information that they had been looking for. And so you got some quite high profile prosecutions off the back of FATCA information. And so I think there was sort of like building a haystack to find the needle in it. That was almost the approach. We've built this haystack and we know which needle we're looking for, and I can see it there. In terms of how the information is used more broadly, in the UK, there's sort of been, they've used a bit of a carrot and a stick approach. So we had something called, it's still there, the requirement to correct regime. And this gave you a period in which if you had offshore tax non-compliance, you could go to the revenue and you could avoid falling into this regime by telling them. And then there were very hefty penalties. And effectively, this was all tied in with CRS, because what they said was, we're getting this information soon anyway, and we will hammer you with heavy penalties up to 200% of the tax, the potential lost revenue. We will hammer you with these penalties, and we will know because we have the CRS information. And they got a great deal of disclosure from that. And I think they are still actually working through their disclosure from that. And so there, the use of the CRS international disclosure regime wasn't the use of the information. It was effectively a stick to go with the carrot of early disclosure and reduction in penalties, etc., for early disclosure. So I think the information will start to be used and will start to trickle through. But the impression again that I get is that there isn't any very extensive data processing yet, but I think that will come. And of course, that gives other issues as well around data protection.
All right. And those are two issues I wanted to ask my next questions about. If we fantasize a step further about the tax authorities' capabilities, from the country's government perspective, would it pay off to invest heavily into IT technologies with the tax authorities now to process this huge data that is coming in, and sort of would it be sort of let's do the cost benefit analysis?
Yeah, I think so. I think that I think what we shouldn't do is conflate all the international exchange regimes into one. So DAC 6 is different from CRS because DAC 6 is about behaviors rather than simple account opening. Yeah. So DAC 6 is related to the disclosure of tax avoidance schemes regime in the UK, and that has almost been more about altering behaviors, and you can see that from the number of reports. One interpretation is that it's too complicated and nobody understands it, and that's why nobody makes a report. Or you could also interpret it as saying nobody wants to make a report, therefore they've stopped doing the things that require a report. Yeah, so you could see DAC 6 as a thing that's aimed at modifying behavior, whereas CRS and FATCA is simply about data sets being transferred. I think they do need to, from their perspective, they should have sufficient technology to deal with it. I know but again, it's all about how the jurisdictions regard the information. So I think the approach that's being taken in more of the Western countries is that if we start an investigation, then we'll go and look to see if we've got any CRS FATCA report, because we just can't deal with all of the data. Some jurisdictions are using CRS FATCA reports to drive investigations, to open investigations. Right. I've got clients where there's been a knock on the door at 8 o'clock in the morning. Come, we need to have a conversation down at the tax office because we've got this report. Whereas I think what you're saying, Harriet, is it's more there is an investigation and then they will go and check the data.
I think that's right, and I do suspect that we'll probably go from that position where it's being used selectively, if I can put it that way, and it's not all being analysed. It's being analysed if there's a reason to analyse it, to the position that you're talking about, Grahame, where it's all being analysed and issues of concern are being picked out of that analysis. I think ultimately that's where it will go, but I don't get the impression that we're there yet. Certainly not in the UK anyway.
Right. Have you reported anything under DAC 6 already?
Yes. I've been involved in a DAC 6 report,
right.
which would have also been covered by MDR.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't had to report any myself. I think that's going to be quite rare for barristers, but I have had to advise people to make reports. Yeah.
Right.
I think there's a lot less reporting than the EU thought there was going to be.
That's why I'm asking.
Yeah.
I haven't done the reporting as well.
So I think what happens when people who don't work in the actual industry, well, they have a vision of what we do, which is not what we do. So I think that they think that, you know, there's huge bags of money lying around in people's offices and it's all hidden and nobody knows, you know, with sort of post-it notes with people's names written on. Like it's just clearly not like that. I think they thought that there would be floodgates of reporting. I think the Portuguese approach of making domestic arrangements reportable, I think, is actually quite interesting. I think there would be more domestic reports than there would be cross-border. I think there's more things going on domestically that are actually happening across border.
But in the UK, it's been this domestic reporting obligation has been for a while there, for many years actually. So does it work in practice?
In 2016, there were 16 reports under DOTAS.
Okay.
5 of which were voluntary.
So I think with DOTAS, as you've noted, it's got a long history dating back to the early part of this century, which is now quite a long history. And it's a complicated regime. It's made more complicated by the fact that 2 things. One, the legislation keeps changing. So what arrangements are reportable keeps changing. And 2, it's a lot of the arrangements are connected to there has to be a nexus with tax avoidance, and there is a big range of views in the UK as to what for English law purposes, I should say, constitutes tax avoidance. And so people have tended to take 2 routes on the UK reporting. The first is to make overly cautious voluntary reports. And the other one is to stick their fingers in their ears and sort of go, la, 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 I can't hear you, and ignore the whole regime. So I think initially, back when the regime first started, there was more reporting, but the UK has really cracked down on marketed avoidance schemes. We have so many targeted regimes now, targeted anti-avoidance regimes. We have the general anti-abuse rule. And what I've seen, I've been at the bar now for about 12 years, and what I've seen in the course of that time is the number of people selling marketed avoidance schemes go from an awful lot to really single or very low double figures. The sort of the people who focus on that as their focus of business. When I started, big accountancy firms were doing it, big banks were doing it, and now it really is just very few firms who specialise in selling those sorts of arrangements. So it has changed a lot, and I suspect back in the early days there were probably a lot more reports under DOTAS, but whether or not how much DOTAS has fueled that sort of fight against tax avoidance, I don't really have a view on, I don't think.
It doesn't help that large swathes of the provisions are absolute nonsense and impenetrable and difficult to understand. It's a drafting technique which is done almost, I believe, an approach taken to make people worried about it.
That's certainly one explanation. It is certainly, I agree, it's certainly what I would describe in court as being opaquely drafted. So yes, it is. It's very dense. It's not always clear what it's getting at, and unfortunately, we see this increasingly in tax legislation, certainly in the UK, that it's drafted broadly and then it's narrowed down by reference to what an individual revenue officer or a revenue policy thinks, and it's not a good way to draft tax legislation, or any legislation, but particularly tax legislation.
To go back, Yanis, we talked about GDPR before, data protection, very fleetingly. I think it's defensive reporting for me by banks or financial institutions, especially on the DAC 6. We're going to see it because they want to make sure that they are definitely complying, but they need to remember that they have 2 obligations here. One is to the data protection regime. They can't just push out information just to be sure, because that's a breach of the client's data protection rights. I've had one situation with a client where there's been a report, the report was wrong, the boxes were filled in wrong, things were characterized as things that weren't, the figures were wrong because they took a very, very conservative approach on the figures, and they included capital where it should have been income, whatever, it doesn't really matter, but that client has ended up with an investigation as a result of that erroneous report.
Right.
And you think, it's not all about the compliance obligation. You still do have obligations to the people that pay your wages, not just the people that can give you a fine.
Sure. And this brings me to my next question about where is the line between sort of data privacy and this huge information that is bulks of information that is now in the possession of the tax authorities, and how to protect the companies. We even have one case now from Latvia in ECJ where the ECJ will look into this, where they are the tax authorities requested all information about the advertisements where people are selling their used cars and online, and the tax authorities requested, please give us the full database of these sellers. And the company who is in charge of this database said, no, we have obligations under GDPR, and we are not sort of disclosing your data phishing expeditions. So
Yeah.
do you have some comments as to that, especially in sort of sense that not only in Latvian tax authorities but also worldwide we have seen cases where there's been even data leakage from the tax authorities?
Yeah. So for me, I mean, to think about that specific case, I think that and without any giving advice on Latvian law or predicting what might happen, it feels to me like that what's happened there is the authorities have jumped the gun, and if they just waited for DAX7, they would have probably had that information anyway. So obviously the car selling platform can only reveal information. The GDPR exemption is only for that which you are legally obliged to give. And if they're not legally obliged to give it, they should say no.
Right.
But that's about whether I'm guessing the authorities reckon they've got a right to demand the information. But it's DAX7 will extend reporting, won't it, to online platforms like eBay and things like that. So that's coming next year. It seems like they were just impatient. They should have waited. But it's really good that somebody's pushed back, because foreseeably relevant is an important test. And
it's a really important test, and it comes up in other information exchange contexts. And Grahame is going to roll his eyes now because I'm going to talk very briefly about tiers, which are for
Harriet's favourite.
They might well be. They might well be my favourite. These are the agreements. These are bilateral agreements that means under which one country can ask another country for information, so as opposed to automatic exchange. And foreseeably relevant has been a concept in those, and indeed an information exchange under double tax treaties for quite a long time. And it is one that is glossed over by the courts. And I think hasn't been sufficiently dealt with, looking at the courts of a number of jurisdictions, so sort of the UK, Jersey, BVI, I've looked at a bit, some Caribbean jurisdictions. It's the main protection for the taxpayer, and it is something that I think has been interpreted broadly and hasn't been considered closely enough. So it is a really important test, and it's one that we don't know enough about.
Right.
I think that one of the problems. So Harriet's correct that that question of foreseeably relevant does need to be considered more. But I think one of the problems that we have is that not us now that we're outside the EU, but one of the problems that you have is that these provisions are being drafted by officials, the EU directives, and there's no direct democratic accountability to the people who are drafting it, the commissioners. Whereas a local politician would feel much more pressure around citizens' rights, whereas the EU, central EU organisation, is solving the problem of tax avoidance. So the balance may have moved too far to one way than the other, and I really don't know how to solve that, other than pressure from citizens.
Okay, let's not solve that right now. Let's go to your podcast. I wanted to talk about this as well, definitely. Ladies and gentlemen, podcast is called International Tax Bites, and it's very easy to learn some new stuff if you scroll. If you open just Spotify or Apple Podcasts and go to International Tax Bites, there are a lot of interesting series episodes where you can learn not only about information exchange, you can learn about stuff like permanent establishment, corporate tax residency, personal tax residency, domicile, all sorts of stuff. And what I really like about the podcast is that after listening to some of the episodes, I have a feeling I know you for a long time. And although we are meeting for the first time, and from the podcast, I also I know something a little bit about your personal life. I in the episodes I love that you smile and have some jokes. Um, my most burning question about the podcast is what is the name of the lovely newborn we've heard in the background of your podcast?
That is my little girl, Hesper.
Right. Do you combine your roles of mom and tax advisor, or just mom and podcaster for now?
No, it's still mum and tax advisor. I have a lot of support from my husband when he's in the country, and we have the most wonderful nanny called Debbie in the whole world. She is fantastic, and she means that Debbie manages all the other aspects of my life and my children, so that I can both enjoy my children and still do my job. So I'm very lucky like that.
Right. And what did you mean by bites? Is it like bite and chew, or
So it's for the listeners, it's important to know that it's BITES, not BYTES, because if you put international tax bites with a Y, you get some PwC thing. Or there's another there's a Big Four podcast called International Tax Bites with a Y. No, it may have seemed arbitrary to Harriet, but I originally did a series of YouTube lectures about Gibraltar tax called Tax Bites, and then it became International Tax Bites. So it's it's a sub brand, but now it's bigger than the original brand because I haven't done those for a while. But
and I should say that Grahame is the driving force behind International Tax Bites, and he also does all of the editing. So whenever I say something inappropriate or laugh too much, or you can hear me drinking, it's Grahame who sorts all that out.
She does a lot of drinking.
Non-alcoholic, I hasten to add.
Right. And how did you come across the idea of the podcast?
Did I just suggest it? It grew out of the things that I was doing during lockdown for YouTube. Because what happened was I did DAC 6 training online through Zoom. I trained a large proportion of Gibraltar's fiduciary industry in groups of 5 or 6. I rolled out training to every single practitioner in our firm first, and then my wife got very sick of the lecture that I gave on DAC 6. She's heard it about 15 times, and then as I sort of was instructed by fiduciaries to do the training, we have a piece of software that allows you to automate DAC 6 analysis. It's basically a spreadsheet with some pull down menus, but it works really, really well. And then I rolled that out to the fiduciaries, and then I started to do sort of like, instead of doing a talk in house and getting people to come in, because we were in lockdown, I did it on YouTube, and then that got put up on YouTube. And then it just became a natural outgrowth of that to say, should we, once me and Harriet started collaborating, why don't we do something around this? That'd be fun. It seemed like a fun idea at the start.
Oh, come on. I think it's still fun. And I think last weekend I sent Grahame a list of potential topics for the next series. So I still think it's lots of fun.
No, it is fun. The thing that I find, I think you do, Yanis, you do your recordings in batches, don't you? You don't do one every week and then put it out. I think we
No. Yeah. I don't do schedules. I just improvise.
Yeah, so I think we put ourselves in a straitjacket of trying to do one a week when we did a series, but then obviously Harriet having a baby sort of made that a little bit difficult.
I'm sorry.
Right.
There is one episode where Harriet is actually in the early stages of labour where we recorded it because she didn't want to sit there doing nothing, so we recorded an episode of the podcast.
Right.
It's quite a lot of editing that day.
Gee.
That's the commitment she's got.
I wanted to say that I really like the content as well, not only the fun you're having during the podcast. I think it's an easy way to learn, and it's good to hear a discussion of those novelties and when you go deeper into analyzing stuff. Your listeners are in more than 65 countries, you said. Who is the person you do the episodes for?
Do we just do it because we like the sounds of our own voice? I think that might be part of it.
Do you know what? I think from my perspective, the way it's sort of evolved, and it has been sort of quite organic, we didn't have necessarily a clear idea where it was going. The people that we're talking to are, I think, people like us, but people like us over the years. So one of the things that I love about tax is that it's always changing, but you also get this constancy of the concepts that always come up, and that's particularly so in international situations. So if you're advising somebody and there's an international element, you might have to look at 3 or 4 regimes that aren't particularly familiar or that are new, but you're still going to need to know where they're resident, or if they're resident in more than one place, or how to interpret a double tax treaty. And those are the things that I think, looking back from where I am now, that you had to learn over the years. So to a little bit, you're sort of speaking to you 10 years ago and 5 years ago, but also to people who will be familiar with the concepts and use them all the time, but who might, like we all do, sometimes benefit from a refresher on something that one uses regularly. That's who I'm talking to. I don't know who Grahame's talking to.
So I think I sort of thought it through, that interested individuals, C-suite people that sit and listen to very important tax lawyers saying things that they don't understand, and students really were my students and trainee younger lawyers that are moving towards tax. That because when I first started working in tax, I didn't have any formal training other than the training that I got to be a lawyer in general. So I sort of had to learn these concepts as I went along, and it would have been really useful for me to have a thing that I go, my boss started talking about residence. What's that? I'll go and read about that. But you mentioned the number of countries that we listen to in the world. It's absolutely insane. I mean, it's more than 65 now. I think it's 70 something. I mean, who would guess that we'd have more listeners in Uganda than we do in Australia? And that's entirely insane. Though you did a case in Uganda, didn't you, once?
I was the second junior on a massive oil tax case in Uganda back in about 2011, 2012. So nearly a decade ago now. Yeah. So I don't know if that's had an effect or not. Possibly not. It would be nice to think it had.
That's where we've got our listener base from. And I'm just looking down the list now. We've got more listeners in Nepal than Malta.
What are we doing wrong for Malta? That's what I want.
What are we doing right for Nepal?
And you have a fan in Latvia as well.
Yes, you're on the list. I saw you on the list. Not you personally, but I saw the Latvian flag on this. It's fantastic. I mean, the technology is fantastic. You can drill down to which state your listeners. I'm sure you look at it, Yanis, as well. Drill down to which listeners, which state you've got listeners in the US, and it's fantastic.
Definitely. Guys, we're running out of time, but I still have some questions left. Can we run for some 15 more minutes? Is it okay?
I think so. Yeah. Let's.
Okay, great. I just if we go on with this podcasting, then what would be the trigger when you say yes, our podcast has reached its aim? Do you have some feeling? You already mentioned a couple of examples about that. What's your feeling?
Can we ask that question again? I didn't quite follow.
Sorry. What would be the trigger when you can say yes, the podcast has reached its aim? I mean, would your aim be to more like educate the specialists or receive a feedback or reach the wider audience?
I don't think I have an aim. I think it's just a hobby. I just like doing it. I would be very happy if more people knew more about tax as a result of it.
Yeah, and actually, I think one of the things that has been wonderful from my perspective is how many of the people who've listened to it are people who that we know of aren't necessarily specialists in tax and have genuinely learnt something, and for them it has been a learning experience. It has been something new for them, particularly sort of younger people coming into tax or coming into law, and that's actually been a really nice. I hadn't really thought of that to begin with, and that's been lovely. But in terms of an aim, I think we didn't have one. Maybe we should have one now. Maybe we should get an aim.
You made us think about our being there, Yanis, in a way that we haven't done before.
Right.
No, I think it. You get the feedback, and I'll go back to the young woman that contacted us the other day. You get the feedback, and they say, "Oh no, I understand this better now." Even from people who, frankly, should know better, should know more about it. It's really it's a good feeling when people say, and I think one of the things I would be most proud of is that we would make a dry topic accessible.
You are quite good at that. And
well, that's nice.
Thank you.
And how do you try to differentiate from other podcasts? I guess there are quite many out there on taxation as well.
I don't think there's anybody that does exactly what we do. I think
no.
You tend to get the. I'm sorry, Harriet. You tend to get. I talk over all the time. I get told. I think that not by other people. This is basically what we do all day. So one of you tend to get the big four accounts, the people that produce podcasts because they've got a department that produces podcasts, and they'll get they'll have a wonderful podcast for 20 minutes about their new appointment in Paris, or whatever, and that's frankly of no interest to anybody other than customers of that big four accountant and people within the big four accountant themselves, so they can burnish their reputation within the firm. I mean, frankly, entirely boring hearing about the new guy that's head of I don't know, VAT in Berlin for a big four accountant. That's not what I'm interested in. And then you have the guys that do sort of like Jack Bonehill at the Tax Professionals podcast, and he does sort of like career development. Whereas what we're doing, what I originally envisioned it as being, was almost like the student on the ADIT or the Chartered Tax Advisors course that wants to listen to something to top up what they've read or they didn't quite understand it. I think that's what I'm trying to do, and I think we're just having a chat, aren't we? Really?
Yeah, I think so. I think, and yes, and I think Grahame and I this may not be fair, and Grahame will correct me if he disagrees. I don't think either of us are. I don't see myself as a traditional barrister. I'm not male. I'm not posh. I'm not rich. And so I think what I like about what we do and what I think differentiates us is the fact that we're not quite like what you're expecting, maybe. And so I think maybe that does make it more accessible if you're not from that particular mold. And there's nothing wrong with being from that particular mold whatsoever, I hasten to add. But I think it does make it more easy to access if you're not from that mold, particularly for people, as I said, at the start of their careers.
Yeah, so I think it's very important. Neither of us are what you would expect us to be given our position. Though hopefully we're both very good at what we do. And we both take a very, not just in this, but in our work in general, we take a very plain English, and that plain English word, that phrase means something. And we are against over flowery language, against dressing things up and trying to look like you're impressive because of the way that you speak. So I think it's very important for us to explain difficult concepts simply. And what a lot of lawyers do is explain difficult concepts in a more difficult way than is necessary to make themselves look clever. And unfortunately, if you're explaining it to another lawyer, he already knows all the words and he's not impressed. And if you're explaining it to a client, then he has no idea what you're talking about. So you need to approach it as if you're talking to a normal human being. And that's hopefully what we try and do, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that is very much it. I think we present it as we would like it to, as we would like complex concepts in other areas to be presented to us when we're lay people.
Yeah. And like people talk to each other, we talk to each other on the podcast as if we were sitting around having a coffee or a beer, talking about something, go, oh, this is mad, I don't understand what's this. Can you just refine that for me? Like that's the way it should be.
Yeah. And like I said, that's what I really enjoyed in your podcast. And you mentioned this tax professional podcast. What was your experience there?
So I did an episode with Jack Bonehill at the Tax Professionals podcast, and he's trying to help people with their soft skills of like how to give advice, and that's aimed at the junior guy in an accountancy firm who's sitting there thinking, I don't really know what I'm doing. How do I develop as a professional? And I did an episode around the approach to advice, and I think essentially what I've just said is what I said on that podcast as well. But it's definitely a different approach. So he'll do more around how to pass an exam, how to do this, how to do that, whereas what we do is talk about concepts.
Right.
I haven't found anybody else who's talking about concepts like we are, apart from maybe taxation matters, I think. But we were on the front. We were the first on the front page of Apple Podcasts. I was very happy about that when that happened.
This is one of my favourite things. I randomly at odd times get texts from Grahame when he's obviously checking the sort of the podcast progress, and he'll be like, "We're in Nepal. Someone's listening to us in Nepal," or "We're on the front page." So it's been really interesting. I've never done anything like this before, and it's been fantastic, and I'm surprised and pleased by how much I've enjoyed doing it.
I've been listening to a podcast called Darknet Diaries, and one of the episodes discusses how those lists can be manipulated. And but do you listen to some other podcasts as well besides taxation?
I do. I'm a big fan. I'm afraid I'm going to. It's such a cliche. I'm a massive fan of true crime podcasts. But yes, I listen to a variety of things. I'm a horse rider, and so I listen to some about sort of like there's some good ones about sports coaching and sports techniques and things like that I listen to as well. So yes, I'm a massive fan of the form. I think it's really great. Half an hour on a dog walk. It's fantastic.
I really like it as well. I listen to, I think, quite a lot of history podcasts, but the one that I'm listening to at the minute is called The Rest is History, which has got two famous English historians, as much as any historian is famous, Dominic Sandbrook and Tom Holland, and they're absolutely excellent if you're interested in history, both English, UK and global. It's really, and they do. I think what they do is actually something similar to what we do, which is just chat about the topic.
Right.
Not that I'm saying we're as good as Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook.
Yeah, that seems unlikely, to be honest.
But it's a similar discursive style.
And in the first message you wrote me on LinkedIn, Grahame, when we connected, you said that do you notice that I'm a fellow tax podcaster? How did you notice the tax stories?
I think I might have Googled tax podcast and you appeared. I think then you were on SoundCloud. You've got a wider distribution now, haven't you? No, I found you and listened. I was just interested in understanding what other people were doing, because we were working entirely in isolation at that point. And now it was interesting to reach out and see if there was any tips, or because you looked like you'd been around longer than we had. I think we actually started at the same time. Yeah. Yeah. So just to see how different people were approaching it, and again, your podcast is different because yours is about stories and life stories and professional personalities. Wow, are we a personality?
Of course,
just one
you
between the two of us. Yeah,
yeah, we've got one between two. In classic English school style, we've got one between two. So it was just really interesting to see. I found you, I found a couple of others, but it was. I was quite interested. You have some big names. You have people from like the IMF and proper.
Yeah,
I don't know what we're doing here.
yeah,
I was
no, absolutely.
I was lucky. It just it's amazing how with those podcasts how the world becomes so small and suddenly you can talk to basically anybody and you just it's up to your imagination.
I think we're in the next series. I think we're going to go more. We're going to run out of concepts to discuss. I think that's what the issue is. So we're going to move more towards having a guest every now and then, and sort of trying to get an external input onto the topics of the future of tax. But right now we've still got things to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we think we have. Whether or not other people will, I don't know. But yes.
People in Nepal love it. Stop it.
And Harriet mentioned that she's listening to podcasts when walking her dog. What would be typical situation when you are listening to a podcast, Grahame?
When I'm cooking, when I'm walking to work, when I'm walking back from work, when I'm walking my dog. We're a very dog-based format.
Right.
Yeah, no. So just any downtime, I use it to fill the gaps.
Right. And as we are really now running out of time, as you probably know, I'm finishing my podcasts with a question to my guests about their version of their meaning of their life. So, what would be your answer to that?
To the meaning of life.
Yes.
My first degree is in philosophy. It's a big topic. I would say do everything well, to the best of your ability. Don't skimp on anything. Like strive to do everything well.
Right. For you, Harriet?
I think for me, it's about an acceptance that not everything is obviously going to be enjoyable in your life, but you should try and find the joy in everything that you do, which I apply a lot to work because while there's lots that I love about it, there are the bits that one doesn't like quite so much, aren't there? So yeah, I think that's sort of how I try to live my life.
Right. So I really enjoyed every minute of our conversation, and thank you really so much for your time. And I really will follow your podcast episodes, and let's keep in touch.
Excellent.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.